Imagine you're being entered into a cross-country race in a country that you've never been to before. And like on the plane flight there, your coach or whatever is not going to let you look at anything about that country or its terrain. And you're blindfolded until you get to the race. And then you're at the starting line with all the other competitors and a gun fires. And then you're just supposed to go. You're far more likely to win that race had you been able to come a week earlier, explore the terrain, get to know the environment a little better. You'll feel just way more confident about all the things you learn, and all the things you learn will connect stronger in your brain, being more familiar with that environment. So we're going to first take a look at Blender's default user interface. We're going to deactivate Sensei format to do that. And then we're going to talk about a few changes to that interface that Sensei format makes to kind of combine things and make them tighter and nicer and cooler. Okay, so let's deactivate Sensei format. I'm going to go to File, Sensei format, click Deactivate Sensei. Just go ahead and click OK. And then when we click Blender back open, we are back to Blender default. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about something now that when I first learned it, it blew my mind. And I had been using Blender for several years without somehow never putting this together, never realizing this. And as soon as I did, it immediately made Blender like 10 times less intimidating for me. It actually gave me the courage and the bump to start doing what I'm doing right now. Like I felt that much more in control of it. And that is the fact that everything that you are looking at on this screen is composed of one of these 17 different editor types. As you can see here, this menu is called editor types. So up here, this is one of these 17 editor types. As you can see, the little icon is that little eye. So you come down here and you realize, oh, that's an info editor type. And so the 3D view, which is where we see our models and actually edit things and do cameras and lights and stuff, that is this little cube icon. And so down here you have a timeline editor type. And then over here you have a properties editor type. But notice that with each one of these drop downs, you can change any of these editor types to any of the other existing editor types. So for instance, up here in this little box here, it is the editor type of, you can follow its little icon to learn what it is. It's the outliner. However, I could change this properties panel to an outliner, or I could switch it to a 3D view. In fact, I could change all of these to 3D view if I wanted to. So I could change that one to a 3D view. The main one already is a 3D view. We could change this to a 3D view. And we could change this to a 3D view. And now we've got a screen full of nothing but 3D view editor types. So ultimately, the real power behind Blender is the ability to arrange these different editor types into a meaningful workspace. So that's actually what a collection of editor types together on a screen is. It's called a workspace. So if I go ahead and switch this one back to the info editor type, you'll notice this little box to the right of where it says help. And this lets us change the different preset workspaces. And remember, a workspace is just a collection of these editor types strewn out across the screen in a meaningful way. So although there are 17 different editor types, each editor type has some similarities. So to understand these similarities, we can talk about all of the parts of an editor type, or the editor type's anatomy, if you will. So they all have some things. So for instance, notice these little diagonal lines at the bottom left corner of this 3D view, and these little diagonal lines at the top right corner. So every one of these editor types has these little diagonal lines at the bottom left and the top right. And what these little lines let you do is merge these editor types into a single window or split them. So for instance, this 3D view is taking up most of the screen, but if I were to click on these little lines here and click and drag and pull this over, I now have two 3D windows. And so I could come over here and change this to something else like the UV image editor. You can also merge and combine these editor types. So I could click back on these lines, click and hold and drag this over, and then you'll see that big arrow show up, which means it's going to merge with that window. So we do that and it closes back. Another thing that all editor types have is what's called the header menu. This is ironically called a header menu because oftentimes the header menu of an editor type will be at the bottom of that screen. So for instance, this is the header menu of this 3D view, and it's sitting at the bottom. However, I could change it to go up to the top. You can right click on that header menu and press flip to top. And this is why sometimes you'll find a editor type's menu is at the top of its little window, and sometimes it's at the bottom of its little window. But I'll go ahead and right click on this and press flip to bottom. So the things they all have are diagonal lines in the bottom left corner and in the top right corner, used to merge and split them, or create new windows so you can change their editor types to different things. And then they all have these header menus. Another thing you'll commonly see are these little plus tabs. And whenever you see one of these plus tabs, what it means is that a menu is hiding in that editor type. So for instance, in this big 3D view editor type here, there is another menu over here, which in the 3D view, this menu on the left here is called your tool shelf. And this menu on the right, which if we click that little plus sign, is your properties shelf. Now in Sensei format, if you press T, this will display both your tool shelf and property shelf at the same time, but in Blender default, you have to press N to dismiss that and T to dismiss that. But the important thing to note is that most all of these editor types, you'll find these little plus tabs, which means that they have additional little menus that can pop out on the side. So that's pretty much the anatomy of an editor type. It's going to have these little lines here, which let you split them or merge them. And it's going to have a header menu, which you might find at the bottom of it, or you might open one up and you might find it at the top. And it's going to have these little plus tabs, which will display shelves, which you can usually open and close in Sensei format by just pressing T. I realize that this is a lot of information about the user interface, like really early on in this training series. So I'm not expecting you to remember all of this stuff or even half of this stuff. That's not what's important. What's important is that you get a mental map of kind of the way that this program works. And what that's going to do is create a reference point when you're learning about stuff in these future tutorials, and it will help them just make a lot more sense a lot quicker, because you, at the very least, have this kind of stuff in your subconscious that a workspace is composed of all these editor types, and that there are 17 different editor types, and a workspace is just different editor types arranged on a screen in Blender, and that's all Blender is. So you might think of this up here where it says File, Render, Window, Help, like, oh, that's just a standard file menu. That's like any file menu in any program. It's actually not. This is actually a full-sized regular editor type with all the anatomy parts that we just explained, a header menu, and then the main window, and then menus and all that. If I were to click up here and drag this down, the big actual window part of this info editor type displays information about different things we're doing here in our scene. And as you can see, it also has a diagonal line at the bottom left, diagonal line at the top right. It has a header menu. I could actually right click on this and flip it to the top, which would be pretty weird because it would get lost once we drag this up. Or, oh, I guess it wouldn't. Hey, that could be kind of handy. So like I said, I'm not expecting you to remember all of this stuff at all. I just want it somewhere floating around in your subconscious so it will help connect when you're doing other things in the future. So I'm going to quickly run through all of these different editor types to sort of give you a brief overview about what they are. I'm going to go ahead and right click this and press flip to bottom. But once again, I'm not expecting you to remember all of this at all. At the top here, we've got the Python console. And Python is the programming language which is used to control a lot of the user interface stuff behind Blender. It controls the way Blender looks and how a lot of the tools and functions work together. And a code console is basically a place where you can type line by line to give the program commands to do stuff. So I could type a command like print pie like pie. And then if I hit enter, the console will print out I like pie. So that's the Python console editor type. Then you have a file browser. This is normally what we use to open up files, different stuff like that. It's pretty self-explanatory. And notice too, this sometimes trips me up. Depending on where you open a menu, that menu might be displayed in reverse. So notice that when we click on this editor type button to select the editor type that we're looking at, notice that it ends with this Python console here. However, if we click it here, the list is in reverse. And that makes sense. You don't want the menu you're looking at, cut off on the screen, but sometimes it can kind of confuse you about the placement of things. But if we go up to the next one, info, that's the one we use up at the top here for saving your file and stuff like that. See, the menu is flopped around again, so just be aware that sometimes menus will do that. Just remember the same items are there, but they get swapped around depending on if you open it too close to the bottom of the screen or too close to the top of the screen. So what would be the next one? User preferences, which we've dealt with quite a lot already when installing the Sensei format add-on, but there's a bunch of other things where you control about the way Blender looks and handles hotkeys and themes and stuff like that. Just another one of those 17 editor types. Then you've got the outliner, which this displays everything that is in your scene. Like for instance, there's this lamp here. You can see it in the outliner. There's a cube. You can see that cube. And properties. This displays both properties about your whole scene and file, but then also about specific stuff you have selected. So if I click on this little tab here of this properties panel we've opened, this is going to give me information about this cube we have selected. However, if I were to click on that camera, notice now we're seeing info about that camera. So the properties panel editor type gives us info about both about our entire scene with like stuff like this render tab and this render layers tab and the scene tab and world tab, stuff about how your world environment will look, but then also individual stuff you have selected. And it's hard having to, because these menus keep flopping up and down because these header menus are sometimes on the top and sometimes on the bottom. But the next one is this logic editor. And this is mostly for dealing with Blender's game engine if you are in the Blender game engine. So we're not going to get into that right now. Then you've got this node editor, which this is a huge part of Blender. So the node editor is used a lot more in the Cycles render engine than Blender render. But it basically lets you set up node systems to control the way things look for both materials or the whole world or what have you. Then you have the text editor, which this is used to write scripts that do things. So we're not going to be getting into that. And then you have a movie clip editor, which this is for opening actual movie files like, .avi or .mpeg or whatever, and then, hacking up clips to do stuff. Then you've got the video sequence editor, which after you're done editing like a specific clip with the movie clip editor, you would probably be using the video sequence editor to paste together all the clips that you had edited with the movie clip editor. Then you have the UV/image editor, which this is where you deal with texture images and stuff like that. And it's also where if you render your image, it will show up. Then you have the NLA editor, which stands for nonlinear action, and it's basically another way to control the animation of your objects and stuff going on in your scene. Then you have the dope sheet, which gives you specific control over keyframes that you animate. And you have the graph editor, which is for more detailed control of individual keyframes. Now we're getting into really complicated stuff. So you've got these keyframes which represent a frame in your animation, but that keyframe can be composed of X, Y, and Z position, rotation. And then the graph editor gives you very specific control over every little element of a keyframe. And then the timeline, this is what's open by default in Blender default, normally at the bottom here, which when we switch these all to 3D views, it got changed. But if I switch that back to the timeline, that's what's normally there, which This is basic animation playback control stuff. And then back to the 3D view, which this is where we navigate our 3D worlds, where we add objects and edit them and model and sculpt and paint. And basically do most of our work in the 3D view. So like I've said several times now, a workspace is composed of different editor types, usually for a specific goal. So you've got an animation workspace. So all the editor types here are related to animating things. And you've got a scripting workspace, which obviously you've got your console open, you've got your info editor here, and a place where you can open up text files and make scripts and stuff. So another interesting thing about these workspaces is that you can actually delete them, and you can also duplicate them and create your own. But we've messed up these workspaces quite a bit, so I'm going to go ahead and go to File and New and Reload Startup File. And so we're back to the default Blender startup file here. However, if we wanted, we could press this plus sign. And notice now when I click on the workspaces, there's now a default workspace, but also a default 0.001. We could actually rename this to something like my workspace. And we could change this up. We could say we wanted the header menu of this properties to be on the bottom. We could right click here, click flip to bottom. We could change this here, or maybe we wanted the properties panel to take up the entire menu there. We could do that. Say we wanted this split in half and we wanted this to be a UV image editor. We could do that. If we wanted to have this available, all we would do is go to File, Save Startup File, click that. And so now if we were to quit Blender and then come back and open it up a few days later, we have access to our own custom workspace made of our own arranged editor types. You could actually, if you wanted to, merge all of these editor types together until you had nothing but a workspace that was composed of just one single editor type. So if I were to close this and then merge these and then merge this file one down here, and maybe switch this to the 3D view. Now I have a workspace composed of nothing but the 3D view. However, it would be a little hard to save it or do anything because I don't have an info editor in my workspace. So I would click up here, go ahead and switch this back to an info editor, and now I could actually save this as my workspace. I could go to File, Save Startup File. And so here is the original default workspace we had, and here is the my workspace that we created. So once again, I know I've probably dived into a million things that might be over your head if you're just starting out with Blender. That's okay. The point is not that you understand everything that just happened. The point is that this is swimming around in your subconscious as you progress in the series, because it will help a lot of stuff make sense as we go forward. So I'm going to go ahead and under File, under Sensei Format, click Activate Sensei and click OK. So I can go back to the world of Sensei Format, and here we are. So now you can understand a little bit more about how Sensei Format came to be. But then I took it further because I started learning how to code in Blender as well. So in addition to just arranging these editor types, I started creating my own header menus and merging different features together. So for instance, the Sensei Format asset library here. So if I click this button, which is actually located in this 3D view, it's able to control this animation area down here. So if I click that, it opens up my library, and which we've gone over when we set up our library. So I could close that there. For the most part, the Sensei Format workspaces are just exactly what we did a few minutes ago. They're just editor types moved around and changed and set up differently. However, in some areas like this outliner down here, you'll notice you don't see a button to change the editor type. And that's because here I have the editor type button tucked up over to the left, which when a menu gets squished, you can come down and bring your mouse over an area and scroll your middle mouse button and move stuff over. and then you can save the startup file however you want. But in other cases, I have menu bars that have totally removed the option for the editor type to help reduce clutter and create a more unified workspace. One thing you might notice if you are a previous Blender user that's a little different, if you press T to bring up your tool shelf and property shelf here, Blender's tool shelf has by default open what's called an operator menu. In Sensei format, that is kept closed by default, but as you can see, there's a little plus sign indicating that a menu is hiding there. So if you click that, you could open up that operator menu back if you want, or if you need it for in the future. Another difference you'll notice in Sensei format is that there are different and less workspaces. So there's only 3 workspaces. One which is devoted to the bulk of everything you'll do in Blender, which is just called Blender. Then another called Hacker, which is a unified workspace for coding and creating add-ons and stuff like that. And the other is called Shader, which is devoted to creating materials and textures and things like that a lot easier and more of a fluid experience. So I'll click back on Blender. If you're really missing or longing for some kind of workspace that you used in Blender default and you want it available in Sensei format, you can always create a new workspace and then just adjust all of the editor types to be like however you wanted them. So for instance, up here, we could click this plus here, and if we drop this workspace menu down, notice this now says Blender 0.001. You could rename it to, I don't know, I guess the default Blender workspace if you just really wanted that. And then we could recreate that. We could merge these guys, and we could merge this and merge this and split this here and switch this to the basic timeline one and close this guy down. And then normally the outliner editor type is up here. So I'm basically just recreating the default Blender space. But we could drag this here, shut that dude, pull that over, bring this down, and pull this back up. I think this starts out by default on tools, whatever. We could turn on the 3D widget, which is on by default. And so the theming and colors and stuff are a little different in Sensei format, but you could basically recreate these workspaces if you wanted. Oh, I guess the other different thing was that this header menu was up here, so we could right-click this, press flip to top, and I guess that one was flip to top too. There we go. Okay, so, and then I think this property shelf is closed by default. There you go. Okay, so a basic Blender default recreation of the workspace. And if you wanted to keep this, you would just go to File, Save Startup File, and press that. And then so we could switch this back to the regular Sensei format workspace and save startup file there. But then if we were to close that, open Blender back up, and here we would have access to our custom workspace. And there you go. So I know this tutorial was a bit long, but I wanted to do the best I can to give you the strongest footing possible for the road ahead as you continue to learn how to use Blender to manifest all the awesomeness in your brain. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.